Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you this morning. Thanks to Jill and Minnesota Pork for having me out here. Again, my name's Dustin Baker, and I'm on staff with NPPC in the Washington, D.C. office. So I had the privilege of growing up on a livestock farm in mid-Michigan. Went to Michigan State, majored in agribusiness, went on to grad school at Cornell and applied economics. And so this is a perfect job for me and a role for me to work at the intersection of policy and economics and agriculture. And it's really an honor to represent this industry in Washington, D.C. every day. My role, like I said, is really to handle the competition issues and to help others on staff understand what's happening in the industry and help those on Capitol Hill and those at USDA have a little bit better and more clear understanding of what's going on in the industry. And Lord knows that people in Washington, D.C. can use as much help as they can get. So kind of the game plan for today is to give kind of a broad overview of the economic trends that we see both in the broader economy as well as in the pork industry. I don't intend on taking the entire hour. I know I'm the last thing that's standing between you guys and lunch, as well as you guys and heading back to wherever you came from. So I don't anticipate taking the full hour, but please stop me in the middle if you have questions, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So just kind of the overview as we see it. When we look at the economy, the fundamentals remain strong. We had a really strong jobs report that came out last Friday that we'll take a look at here in a second. And overall, we saw some volatility emerge in the stock markets toward the end of last year. But it's important to remember that the stock market is not the general economy as a whole. So overall, the fundamentals remain strong. Now, the government shutdown has dominated the news cycle for the last several weeks. It was the largest or the longest partial government shutdown in history at 35 days. It sure made it pretty eerie living and working in Washington, D.C. to have so many friends that were furloughed and sitting on the sidelines. It also made putting together a presentation that primarily utilizes government data pretty difficult for me to put together today. So we're kind of winging it a little bit. Some of the data is a little bit old, but it's the best that we have available right now. So we'll talk about that. If we look at supply, how it's been so far this year, it's been a lot heavier than what the December hogs and pigs report suggested, with the exception of last week when we saw the impact of the polar vortex. So we'll talk about that as well. As far as we can tell, demand has been pretty good, but we don't have a whole heck of a lot of data as it relates to exports. With exporting almost 30% of production, that becomes pretty important to kind of piece together the overall demand picture. But we'll look at that as well. And again, gains in exports are slowing amid the trade retaliation tariffs that we face, and we'll talk about that as well. But we'll kind of start at the 30,000 foot level and try to put together some of these pieces of the puzzle. As I mentioned, we had a really strong jobs report that came out last Friday. We have unemployment at 4% across the country, and I know here in Minnesota it's much lower than that. This feeds into one of our top priorities that we're working on at the National Pork Producers Council, and that's a workable solution to the labor shortage issue that we face in rural America. So if we have 4% unemployment, that's darn near full employment across the country. So the point that we make to legislators all the time is that there isn't a domestic supply of workers sitting on the sideline just waiting to jump in. In a lot of these rural areas, there simply aren't enough bodies to be in the barns to take care of animals or to be in the packing plants to help harvest the animals. So this plays well into one of our top domestic priorities. So you can see unemployment rate in the red. In the blue is a measure of consumer sentiment, and so that's how consumers feel about the overall state of the economy. That's measured by the University of Michigan, which as a Spartan, it's hard for me to put U of M data up there, but I have to anyway because they do a pretty good job of measuring that. And you can see that really since 2017, the beginning of 2017, that consumer sentiment level's been above 90. And that's kind of an arbitrary number, but it's generally a pretty good indication of how people are feeling about the economy. Usually when people feel good about the economy, they're more willing to spend money. And because our economy is really based upon consumer expenditures, this generally bodes well for the overall economy. If we look at job growth, last Friday was a boom of a report. The economy added 304,000 jobs in January, which was significantly more than what the pre-report estimates were of about 160,000. So it crushed expectations. You can see that we've had 100 straight months of job growth. That's pretty significant. We've had 16 consecutive months of adding at least 100,000 jobs. So those are big numbers. Now, if you look at this, Democrats will be saying on Capitol Hill that, this is just a continuation of what's been happening, right? We've been adding jobs throughout the recovery. Nothing's changed. If you ask the Republicans, they'll say that job growth is accelerating, and these are big numbers that are attributable to President Trump. Like with so many things in Washington, D.C., the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The recovery does continue to chug along. It has slightly accelerated over the last couple months, and we'll see how that continues into the future. One portion of the economy that's taken a little bit of flack over the last several years is the fact that even though we keep adding jobs, wage growth hasn't really picked up to where a lot of people have wanted it to be. If we look at what the report on Friday showed in blue, that's wage growth year over year. We can see that the January wage growth was a 3.2% increase, which you can see is higher than it has been throughout most of the recovery. The wages have grown at over 3% for 12 consecutive months, which that hasn't happened in over a decade. So finally, wage growth seems to be catching up with the hot labor market that we see. In red, I have highlighted the civilian participation rate. This is another piece of the economy that has been taking a little bit of examination from most observers, is that you can see throughout the entire recovery that we've witnessed, that participation rate has never returned to pre-recession levels. There's a lot of different schools of thought as to why that's happened. So the labor participation rate, or civilian participation rate, is the share of workers 16 and older who are actively engaged in the labor market. There's a number of people who are disenfranchised. There's a higher percentage of millennials who are in college, and the opioid epidemic is potentially having some sort of impact on this as well. But you can see, finally, we're starting to see a little bit of an uptick in the participation rate. So that's something worth paying attention to over the next several months as well.
Is that people of working age, or is that all people?
It's age 16 and older.
Okay, so all retired people are still living. Part of that number.
That helps contribute to it as well. Yep. Good question. If we look at the federal funds rate, this has taken a lot of heat from President Trump and his Twitter account. Every time the Federal Open Market Committee meets and decides to raise rates, they usually take a shellacking from President Trump's tweets. If we look, we're still at relatively low effective federal funds rate compared to the historical average. Markets are given the chances of a March hike from the FOMC, about a 3% chance of occurring. As of right now, it looks like there may be 2 rate hikes throughout 2019, which is much slower than what we were looking at about a year ago today. Generally, when we see rate hikes, we see a strengthening in the dollar, which helps provide a headwind against exports. So this is something that we'll be paying attention to as we go forward. And then just one last kind of talking point on the general economy. There's a lot of talk about a potential recession. If we hit this summer still in recovery mode, it'll be the longest period of economic expansion and recovery in U.S. history. The New York Fed puts together a recession probability prediction by taking the difference between a 10-year note and a 3-month note, and adding a probability to the probability of a recession by December 2019. You can see it highlighted in gray. I've highlighted past recessions. You can see generally when that spread begins to rise, we typically enter a recession at some point once we rise too far. At this point, the New York Fed is giving about a 21% chance of a recession occurring by December. Again, whatever goes up must at some point come down. I'm not saying it's going to happen by December, but probably by sometime in 2020. It's something to pay attention to just in time for the next presidential election. So something to pay attention to anyway. So that's kind of the economy as a whole. I'd like to kind of start out from a 30,000-foot level before we get into the nitty-gritty of the pork industry. As I mentioned before, the government shutdown has had some pretty significant impacts on the economy as a whole, as well as being able to analyze the pork market. We know that for 35 days we had 800,000 workers that were impacted or furloughed. 40% of all USDA employees were furloughed during that time. the National Agricultural Statistics Service had to cancel 40 different surveys that they normally publish. Now, some of those surveys we're going to get from them eventually, and some of them were just lost forever. So it's kind of an economist's nightmare to have data points that will never be recovered. We were supposed to have the Ag Census due that comes out every 5 years. We were supposed to have that released on February 21st, and at this point it looks like that'll probably be delayed as well. But what is important is that we were successful in lobbying the government to deem two important functions essential in the event of a shutdown. We did this last January, over a year ago, when we were facing a shutdown that ended up only lasting for a couple hours. But those two functions are food inspectors from FSIS, ensuring that packing plants could remain open and commerce could continue, as well as USDA's AMS's Market News Service, which helps publish the twice daily market reports that give information on the number of heads sold, the manner in which they're sold, and the price at which they're sold. Without those two functions, commerce would have probably ground to a halt or become much more difficult. So luckily, we were able to get those deemed essential, and we're thankful for those who went to work even though they weren't getting paid, those from FSIS and from AMS. As I said, Washington, D.C. was pretty eerie during that time frame, and it was pretty shocking to realize how many people truly are living paycheck to paycheck in this country, even in Washington, D.C., who have a government job. I know some data came out from the Federal Reserve last year that said that 40% of U.S. adults are unable to cover a $400 emergency expense today. If you needed $400 from them, they wouldn't be able to come up with that $400 today, which is shocking to me. But we have until February 15th to see if the government will be funded again. At this point, both sides seem pretty far apart on any sort of compromise. So your guess is as good as mine, but if I was a betting man, I would say that we're looking at another shutdown in about 10 days. So again, we were able to have market news published during the shutdown. So luckily, we were able to look at what production looked like over the first couple weeks. And so these are charts that I put together every week. They all kind of follow the same format. You can see 2019 is in red, 2018 is in green, and the dotted blue line is the 5-year average. And so you can see that production up through the first couple weeks of the year, first couple weeks of January, was well ahead of 2018. Significantly heavier or larger than what the December Hogs and Pigs report were indicating. Last week we saw a little bit of a pullback as it was harder to get hogs to market. I can only imagine how difficult it was for all of you to be out in the barns during that time frame. I know in Washington, D.C., it's a city full of a bunch of wimps. Anytime it gets below 30 degrees, we get a 2-hour delay to work because it's just too dangerous for us. So I can only imagine when it's 60 or 70 degrees colder here and actually having to go to work. So I appreciate everything that you guys do. And I've become one of those wimps since I moved from Michigan to D.C. It's amazing how quick your blood thins out down there. But if we look at weights, live weights were an average of 286 last week, and dressed weights were at 213, slightly lighter than a year ago. Hopefully, we're able to get caught up this week and next, because anytime we have a backup of hogs, that's generally not a good thing. So you can see that if we look at slaughter, it's 1% higher year to date. And one thing that I enjoy looking at is looking at what's really driving the increases or decreases year over year. And so here I have the 4-week average, looking at the number of heads slaughtered in blue compared to a year ago, and dressed weights in red compared to a year ago. So you can see that recently, for the most part, the increase in production that we've had has been driven more by more pigs coming to market rather than heavier pigs coming to the market. Now, there's an awful lot of noise in the blue, and that has a lot to do with holidays and falling on different times of the year. But the point is kind of the same there. If we look at the average net price received over the first couple weeks of the year, I mean, I don't have to tell you guys this. You guys are living it every day. But I think it's interesting to look at anyway. I have 2019 in orange. You can see for the most part, through the first couple weeks of the year, we were tracking with 2016 pretty well. We usually see a little bit of a ramp up in prices here, beginning of the year, coming off of the holiday season. But it's important to note that the difference or the price received truly does depend on the manner in which the prices arrived upon. You can see up in the top right, That's the average price based on purchase type for last week. It's a national average. So you can see the national average across all purchase types was just below $60. But that changed an awful lot depending on if they're negotiated hogs or futures or other formula-based hogs, and so on. Now, included in those other purchase agreements in that net price would include any of those non-carcass merit premiums as well. So, hence it's much higher than the average, but something interesting to pay attention to anyway. One thing that I did look at as well was, comparing to a year ago based on purchase type. And now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that this should dictate how you decide to price your hogs. I just think it's interesting to look at, and I've seen some other market analysts looking at this recently, so I thought it'd be interesting to pay attention to anyway. So overall, hogs are about $14 lower per hundredweight compared to a year ago. Negotiated hogs were almost $18 lower than a year ago, so on and so forth. So this isn't any sort of recommendation. I just thought it was an interesting snapshot of what it looks like out there right now. Now that's on the live side. If we look over at the Carcass Cutout, most of you understand how the Carcass Cutout is put together, but just in case for those of you who don't, the cutout represents an estimate of the value of a 53 to 54% lean 205-pound carcass based upon the subprimal to wholesale markets. So it really provides an indication or an estimate of the supply and demand situation on the meat side of things. So you can see the loin is the largest component of the overall cutout, followed by the ham, followed by the belly, and so on. So what we do is we take the value of loins, multiply it by 25%, and add it to the value of hams times 25%, so on and so forth, to get a composite for the overall cutout. Now, if we look at how that's been performing so far this year, you can see, once again, it's below the 5-year average, and it's below 2018. It's about 18% lower than a year ago, and last week it was about 67.85 for the week. Now, we've been finding some support over the last year or so. Anytime we get to about 65, 67 bucks, we find some support. I think yesterday we were at about 66 bucks, so that seems to be kind of where we start to find support. We can look at individual primal, and we can see that hams are 23% lower than a year ago, as are bellies. Now, hams have been interesting. You can see we started to diverge from the 5-year average last year. We're facing a 20% tariff on hams going into Mexico. Some estimates show that we send over half of our hams that we produce in this country to Mexico. Markets work. They adjust to a new equilibrium. And as a result, we've consistently seen for the last several months that ham prices have been 20% or more lower than they were 12 months prior. We're seeing that again here. So we're still shipping product to Mexico, but it's not necessarily at the same value as it was before. Now we can look at what's driving this the overall lower value in the cutout. So like I said, we're about $15 lower than the 5-year average of the cutout last week. All right, $15. Now if we look at what makes up that $15 difference, you can see it's really across the board. Every single primal is lower than the historical average, led by hams and loins. Okay. Bellies are also lower. Bellies have had a newfound volatility that's been interjected into the market over the last couple of years, and we'll look at that as well. But if we look at the overall cutout here, you can see on the left overall cutout, look how well that tracks the belly. As goes the belly, so too goes the cutout recently. You see a peak in the belly, you usually see a peak in the cutout. Now, one thing that I've been told by a number of market observers is that the loins aren't as important as they used to be. It's not really driving the value of the overall cutout. Bellies are really where the money's at. And I thought it would be interesting to try to show that visually. It seems like most people seem to understand that, but to try to put it visually, I put together this graph, which shows the overall loin share of the cutout. So if you take the loin value, multiply it by the yield, or 25%, and show what percentage of the overall cutout that is, you can see over time that's decreased, right? From a high of about 35% back in the early 2000s to today where it's right about 25% of the overall cutout. So you can see the declining share of the overall cutout that the loin represents. Now we can do the same for hams. You see an awful lot of volatility in the hams, right? So that usually corresponds with Christmas and Easter. But you can see for the most part, if you draw a line of best fit in there, it's been relatively stable over that same time period. Now we can do the same thing with bellies, and it's not as extreme as the loins, but you can kind of see the trend that we've been going. An increase in volatility, but also an increase in importance. So I just think that's kind of interesting. This isn't going to solve anything, but I think it's an interesting way to look at the overall cutout and what's really driving any changes in the cutout value. And if you put them all on one, that's kind of messy, but you can see kind of the convergence of the belly and the loin. Now, a little over a year ago, USDA had put out proposed standards for pork quality that were. It was an attempt to put grading standards to the pork loin in order to increase quality, increase the consumer eating experience. And I think that any stakeholder to the pork industry can agree upon that overarching goal, right? Whether you're a producer, a packer, or a consumer, you want a more consistent, higher quality eating experience. To me, looking at this shows that maybe the loin isn't necessarily the future. Maybe that's not where we need to, hook on our cart to, because there might be other things in the industry going on that we need to be paying more attention to. Coming out of USDA's proposals for the pork quality grading standards, NAMI, the North American Meat Institute, National Pork Board, and NPPC put together a task force to look at pork quality and what can be done in order to increase pork quality. And generally, the consensus there was that we need to really be paying attention to educating consumers on the right pork cooking temperatures. Because if you don't do that, whatever grade you assign it, you can really screw it up once you get it to home. So that was kind of the general feel there, but I just thought that was kind of interesting anyway. Another question that we get an awful lot is looking at packer margins. Now, again, every packer is different, and this is just a gross margin calculation. It's pretty straightforward. You take the cutout value, you subtract the average net cost of the hog, so you get a meat margin, and then you add into that a byproduct value. So these numbers are from LMIC and AMS. But you can see that generally the packer margins have been a little bit more subdued over the last several months than what they normally would have been. That's attributable, I think, to a falling offal market due to the Chinese market being a little bit more difficult for us to compete in, as well as new packing plants that are opening in new capacity. More packers chasing hogs. Generally, that makes it more competitive. And we've seen that over time. You can see 2018 in gray. You can see that last fall, which is usually when those packer margins really start to ramp up, they're a little bit more subdued than normal. And you can see here in 2019, they've been kind of on the downturn as well. Now, again, this isn't profit by any means for packers. They still have to take into account all of their normal expenses, including labor. But generally, when you talk to analysts, they expect that cost to be between $25 and $30 a head for each packer. So you can see, generally, anytime they're above that gray area is when you would expect them to be probably making money on average. But that's just kind of another data point, something interesting to look at. It'll be interesting to see how a new packing plant opening potentially next month will play into this as well. Now, one thing that I always look at when we talk about pork demand is cold storage. And again, we don't really have any recent data on cold storage. The most recent data we have is at the end of November. But you can see that for the most part, overall meat in cold storage was not ramping up to problematic levels. Total red meat supplies in freezers was down 6% from the previous month. It was just up 4% from the previous year. So nothing problematic yet. Frozen pork supplies were down 11% from the previous month and just up 1% from the previous year. So all things considered, when you look at the headwinds that we face on the export market and the amount of meat coming to the market, generally I would say that's a pretty positive position that we're in. Hams were significantly lower than the previous month and the previous year. So that indicates to me that product continued to flow to Mexico, which is a very positive thing for us. If we look at the price of pork in the supermarkets, the United States government reports 4 different product prices from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can see them up on the screen. You got bacon, chops, and hams. Generally, They weren't historically large. Chops and hams have been kind of in the tight trading range over the last several months. Bacon prices have been interesting to watch because it does somewhat track the belly, but usually it's lagged 6 to 8 weeks. So usually you can kind of predict what's going to be happening there in the retail space. But most importantly, when we look at retail prices, we look at what percent is it of beef. Pork is really competing with beef in the meat case. If you take it as a share of beef prices, you can see the overall pork complex as reported by USDA. It's in relatively historically low levels. So historically competitive, which is a good thing. So too are broilers and turkeys, but it could be in a much more difficult position. So that's kind of on the domestic side. One last point. So this kind of gives you an idea of what consumers are looking at as they're looking at in-home consumption. Another way to look at consumption domestically is to look at how restaurants are performing. And so the National Restaurant Association puts together a restaurant performance index, which is kind of a proxy for how restaurant owners are thinking about the economy and thinking about their own customer traffic levels. And you can see anything above 100 indicates expansion. So 100 is kind of the arbitrary number there. You can see the overall index it's been positive since basically August 2016. That's the longest stretch that it's been positive since 2012. So generally very positive, especially as we look at how many times pork is being featured on menus and new menu items. If restaurant operators are feeling better about the overall economy, that's generally a good thing for the pork complex. You can see the expectations index, which is looking 6 months out, also in expansion territory. So that's a good thing. And that's the domestic side. If we kind of shift focus over to the export side of things, we've talked about it ad nauseum in our office. We talk about it every time we have a fly-in. We talk about it all the time, how important exports are to the U.S. pork industry. I wasn't able to hear Aaron yesterday speak from USMEF, but I'm sure many of you did. But the story is very clear. Exports are very good for our industry. Free trade agreements are good for our industry, and our farmers in the U.S. are better than anyone else in the world, and they will outcompete anybody as long as we're able to compete on a level playing field. So it's pretty straightforward. Here I have total exports in dollars since 2002, and it goes through 2017 because we only have data through October right now of 2018. But you can see 2017, it was the second largest amount of exports by value. It was the largest by volume. And you can see I've highlighted the 20 countries with which we have an FTA, or a free trade agreement, in blue. You can see over half of our product goes to the 20 countries with which we have an FTA. That's really, really impressive considering that does not include Japan and it doesn't include China. So, pretty impressive how well free trade agreements work for us. Unfortunately, we've been taking it to the chin when it comes to the trade retaliation that we've been facing. The administration currently is dead set on limiting the trade deficit that we have as an economy, which is not a great measure of economic well-being or the viability of an economy. But if that's the terms that we need to discuss, then we have a great story to tell there as well. We've been running a trade surplus since early 90s in pork. We're a net importer of pork before NAFTA was put into effect. We're a net exporter, providing about 110,000 jobs throughout the rural economy. We tell this story as often as we can to anyone that will listen. So if I sound like a broken record, that's somewhat intentional because, like I said, we tell it to everybody up at USDA or up on Capitol Hill. Looking at 2018, again, we only have data through October, but the year-to-date change through October was just 0.8%. So we continue to post gains from a year ago, but they're at smaller levels. This is on volume. On value, it looks pretty similar. Now, if we look at our major export markets, so these are our top 5 markets by volume. So Mexico is number 1, China's number 2, and so on. So I have each year total exports through October to each one of those markets, and those percentages indicate the change from the previous year. So you can see over on the right, to Mexico in 2018 through October, we've shipped the same amount of product that we did in 2017. In 2017, we'd shipped 13% more than 2016, and so on. Now, it's important, like I mentioned earlier, our value that we've shipped to Mexico was down 9%, but we'd shipped the same amount of product. So markets had adjusted. We're still shipping product down there, but we face a 20% tariff because of our steel and aluminum tariffs that we have on Mexico. So that is our number one issue right now in our office, is getting those steel and aluminum tariffs lifted from Mexico, so the retaliatory tariffs will be lifted on U.S. pork products going to Mexico. Now, China, of course, is a major issue for us as well. I do think that that's kind of a longer game issue. Hopefully we have some sort of resolution between the Trump administration and China by the March 1st deadline that they imposed. We'll see there. But this is definitely something that's been weighing on, I know, a lot of your minds and ours as well in the office. Thank goodness for South Korea. You can see it's been a major growth market for us in 2018. And hopefully that continues to pick up some of that slack that we've lost elsewhere. But you can see the relative size of China compared to the other markets as well. Now, one thing that we pay attention to is weekly pork shipments that come out of the Foreign Ag Service at USDA. Now, there's an awful lot of noise with this data, so that's kind of the first caveat. The second one is that this only measures skeletal meat. So it doesn't include any variety meats or offal or anything like that, which is what China's a big market for us for. But you can see that throughout 2018, which is in blue, our shipments were significantly lower than they were the previous 2 years. And then right toward the end of November, beginning of December, we started to see shipments heading there, which is somewhat atypical for that time frame of the year. And then, of course, the data ran out and we aren't able to see where we ended up for the end of the year. But this was sort of interesting to look at when that data came out on Thursday of each week. You could sort of see the markets react a bit if we saw a big shipment heading to China. And so we're slowly getting caught up with the data there, and hopefully in the next couple weeks we'll be completely caught up. But if we look overall, well, the NAFTA percentage should be 41% there. These are our major markets. You can see the relative share. So 41% of our products go to our NAFTA partners, or USMCA, if that's what we're calling it now. You can see China, Hong Kong accounted for 15%. We grouped China and Hong Kong together because quite often Hong Kong is utilized as a gray channel to get into China. You can see South Korea in 2018 so far has been about 10% of the market. Compare that to 2017 and you can see the slight changes. You see the growth in South Korea. Here's 2018, here's 2017, and you can see the shrinking of China, Hong Kong, from 20% down to about 15% in 2018. Now, China just released, finally, their overall trade data for 2018. So I have to preface this with it's Chinese government data, so you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, but it's the best that we have right now. They hadn't updated their trade data since March until last week. So we can see what's happened to the overall market share. This is in mainland China. So you can see the United States occupied the third largest market share there at 12%. But you can see how much that's shrunk since 2016 when we occupied almost a quarter. So you can see that, we've been obviously the big loser there as we face at least 62.5% tariffs. But other countries have as well. Brazil's been the big winner overall. They've increased their exports to China in 2018 by 208% from the year before. So pretty significant. U.S. imports were 55% lower than in 2017. But overall, the entire pie in China had shrunk as well. They imported less in 2018, about 13% less. Now, as I mentioned, Hong Kong is generally viewed as a gray channel to get into China. And so I've been paying attention to the percentage of our exports that have gone to China and the percent that have gone to Hong Kong as well. So you can see really since the tariffs came into effect, in gray I have the Hong Kong share of imports from the U.S. And you can see that, since the tariffs came into effect, we've seen more going to Hong Kong than we did in the past. But Hong Kong has its own constraints. You can't ship everything through Hong Kong to get into China. So you can only do that for so long. Now, a piece of the puzzle as we look at exports is the value of the U.S. dollar. I've highlighted the 2016 election on there because we saw a little bit of a Trump bump immediately after the election and a strengthening of the dollar. Generally, as we look at this graph, the higher the line, the stronger the dollar, and as a result, the more expensive our products are to foreign consumers, right? The cheaper imports are for us, but the more expensive exports are. If we look at the U.S. dollar against some of our major export markets, again, the same pattern holds. The higher the line, the stronger the dollar, the more expensive our product. We can see in January the dollar actually depreciated against most of our major partners, which is generally a good thing for export products. Now, I've been talking about trade. I have to at least touch on the trade mitigation package that USDA rolled out. And let me be clear in saying that, first of all, our goal is to reopen these markets, get on a level playing field, and resolve the trade disputes. We've never been asking the USDA for handouts or checks or anything along those lines. But the fact that it was open and available, we did go and lobby and help USDA determine the best use of their money to try to help lift all boats within the pork industry. So the trade mitigation package really is a three-legged stool. The first leg has really been getting most of the attention in the media, and that's the market facilitation program. Those are the direct payments that you'd go to the Farm Service Agency and sign up for. It has about $4.7 billion worth in the first tranche. The food purchase and distribution program was $1.2 billion worth of purchases made by USDA to go into non-traditional channels to not compete with normal commerce, but rather go to food banks and shelters. We'll go look at how pork fared there. And then there's $200 million that were allotted to trade promotion programs. The Soybean Association received the largest share of those funds, but USMEF received the second largest share. So hopefully we see some dividends on that. Now, if we look at the market facilitation program, these are the direct payments. Again, it was $8 per pig for your inventory on August 1st, give or take 2 weeks for qualifying producers, knowing full well that not every producer qualified for these payments. If we look at what we really think has the potential to lift all boats, and that is the product purchases from USDA. USDA is slated to spend about $559 million over a 12-month period on pork products. Now, that's significant. So each year, USDA generally purchases between $30 and $50 million worth of product for school lunches or food banks, things along those lines. This purchase is 10 times larger than that. So it's very significant. We think that when it's all said and done, it'll represent about a week's worth of production coming off of the domestic market, which it doesn't make our producers whole. It doesn't make anyone whole, but it helps lessen the impact of the trade retaliation that we're facing, and hopefully buys us some time to get back to commerce as normal. Now, the first quarter of this program is finished up, and here's some results from that through the first 3 months. Now, USDA purchased 51 million pounds of product, valued at $113 million. That's about 20% of the overall allotted dollars that they had put toward this. Again, it's in 4 different tranches, 4 3-month periods. So we're in the second solicitation phase where USDA will put out requests for proposals for the products, and packers and processors are submitting bids to fulfill those. So that will be important as we kind of go forward. Again, a lot of money being injected into getting product off the market to help lift all boats here. Oh, that's not ideal. Screwed something up. Oh, it came unplugged. That's why. Sorry about that. There we go. Almost. Oh, yeah, got unplugged. There we go. Okay, perfect. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. If we look at 2018, ERS put out their net farm income forecast, and you can see 2018 over the last 20 years is expected to rank about the 3rd lowest that we've seen over the last 20 years at $66.3 billion. On average, this is in inflation-adjusted dollars. On average, it's about $87 billion. So you can see it's really being felt kind of across the board. If we look at commodity-specific data, these are cash receipts and year-over-year changes. Again, you guys are living this every day, so I don't really need to tell you guys, but overall expected to decrease about 8% cash receipts. If we look at hogs in particular, expected to be about 5% lower in 2018 at about $20 billion. So we'll get 2019 forecasts once USDA gets caught back up, but somewhat interesting to look at here anyway. The feed crops and soybeans seem a little high to me, especially everything considered, but we'll see where they end up. The moral of the story here is that if we look at all the proteins, we're seeing increases year after year. Pretty consistent step up. Beef is expected to increase about 3.1% in 2019 total production. Pork, USDA has pegged at 5.3%, which is the largest of the proteins. Broilers are up 1.4%, and turkeys up just about 0.25%. So again, kind of steady as she goes. This is generally the theme of any ag talk, right? We have a lot of protein coming to the market. China's a big player. We don't know exactly how that's going to shake out, but I have to at least put that up. If we look at the last WASDE report, which we have a new WASDE report coming out on Friday, they're going to be rolling in all of the January reports from USDA that were withheld, including the crop reports. Those are going to be included in Friday's WASDE report. So it should be a pretty significant market mover. But according to the December WASDE, if we're looking at 2019 production, they had it pegged again at 5.3%. You can see USDA's numbers, price expectations, expecting to once again, top out probably Q2, Q3, somewhere in there, average slightly lower in 2019 than we were in 2018, amid all the production. So just kind of in review, the fundamentals remain pretty strong for the entire economy. Again, how soon can we get on a level playing field, both with Mexico, getting those retaliatory tariffs removed so that we can go to bat for the USMCA up at Congress, as well as getting some sort of resolution to China. The big elephant in the room is ASF in China. That could potentially be a great opportunity for U.S. pork to be able to help fill in that gap, but we have to be able to compete in that market. Again, Friday's report should be pretty insightful from USDA. It'll have a whole lot of information, so there'll be a lot to digest. There's plenty of pork out there, plenty of protein production overall. And I didn't really talk about this much, but this is an issue that we've been paying a whole lot of attention to as a labor issue. Whether I'm talking to packers or talking to farmers, it's very clear that it's getting harder and harder to find and retain good workers out in the countryside. So that's something that we'll be continuing to work on in D.C. as well. So thank you very much for your investment in our organization and for the opportunity to represent you in D.C. And hope you guys have a safe trip home.